Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am going to just give a few seconds for people to trickle in, but thank you so much for joining us today. So on behalf of the Aspen Latinos in Society program, I would like to welcome you to today's Aspen City Action Lab Masterclass on raising public and private capital to build community wealth. Before we get started, I want to do some housekeeping notes. So this webinar will be recorded and then posted. It will go up to 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. And if you have any questions during the discussion, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box. Or if you have any concerns or if you have any issues with the hearing, please also add those in the chat. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the Aspen Institute Latinos in Society program is one of 45 policy programs at the Aspen Institute. Our work focuses on empowering and promoting the long-term economic growth and resiliency of Latino communities throughout the United States. We focus on Latino entrepreneurship, workforce development strategies through digital success, and leadership development. Today's masterclass is the first in a series of trainings with the goal of equipping local leaders with key skills. We want your feedback and engagement so that we can make each session better. Please feel free to send us your recommendations for future topics or future speakers, and you'll have all of our information in the follow-up email after this webinar. Today's masterclass comes out of this moment in time where leaders are thinking about how to raise capital to bring in new investments to their work. There are different types of capital for different types of initiatives. And through this masterclass, we want to give you an overview of different types of investments that can lend themselves to a capital stack. We really want to focus on ensuring that you all know through the expertise of the leaders we have, that you're able to learn more about how to draw those investments and how to implement them to your work. As one of our advisors says, as Bruce Katz says, power belongs to the program, to the problem solvers. And I'm sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather, so that's where my voice sounds. But we are very excited to, through this work, help you get some of that power and be able to execute your initiatives. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Carmen Ortiz-McGhee, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the National Association of Investment Companies. And this is the trade association and largest network of diverse-owned private equity firms and hedge funds. Prior to joining the National Association of Investment Companies, Carmen served as Senior Vice President at Aon PLC and also served as a member of Aon's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. In 2014, she was tapped as one of the Business Insurance Magazine's top 25 women to watch. So thank you so much for joining us today, Carmen, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Eddie, and thank you, of course, to Dominica Lynch for having me here to be a part of this conversation today. I think we're going to have an excellent conversation given who our speakers are. I'm incredibly honored to be joined by Dúran and Tomás Dúran. So, gentlemen, if you could come onto the screen, it would be great while I continue talking. So we are going to be talking about, as Eddie mentioned, kind of, what are the key ways to raise capital. We're going to start, though, by talking about what it takes to build an inclusive economic ecosystem. And so I want to, again, I'm not seeing Dúran and Tomás's faces yet, so I want to kind of ping you to come on screen if you're able.
We're here, Carmen. We just need a host to enable video so we can jump in.
Okay, great.
So sorry. We're working on that right now.
Okay, great. Tomás, why don't we just start with a brief introduction, just provide background on yourself so that we know, who you are and the perspective that you're bringing.
Sure. Hi. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tomás Dúran. I'm the president for Chicanos por la Causa in California, the local affiliate of the larger social service organization. What's more relevant today, though, is that I've been working on economic development in small and medium-sized cities for about 25 years, working to bring capital and capacity in different forms to communities that are trying to generate and jump or sustain a local living economy that pushes back against gentrification, creates wealth, and recycles it locally, so that you're much more in charge of your own financial destiny. So I'm here today to talk about some of those funding sources, what it looks like, what's available in the market. In addition to the work that I've done in the field, I'm also a professor at USC in the School of Public Policy, where I teach the master's level education on economic development and finance.
Outstanding. Thank you, Tomás, and welcome. Darren, please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Carmen. Delighted to be here. My name is Darren Reedus. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Minority Business Accelerator here in Cincinnati, which is an affiliate of the Cincinnati, USA Regional Chamber. Our organization has been around for about 20 years now, exists to grow large-scale minority-owned companies. More specific to our conversation today, for the past 18, 19 years, I've also been very much involved in the building and development of inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems and all that entails. And so super excited to be a part of this afternoon's conversation and can't wait to get started.
Outstanding, excellent. And thank you both for joining and taking the time to contribute your insights and expertise with the audience. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about let's start high level, right? We'll start at the 100,000 foot level and say, can you talk about from each of your perspectives, right? Darren, you from more of the operating entrepreneurial and Tomás from the real estate development sort of, angle. What are the key components of an inclusive economic ecosystem? Darren, I'll start with you.
You start with me, sure.
Yep.
So I like to, when we talk about ecosystems, I like to unpack and define them a bit by institutions and then kind of weave in the inclusive aspect of that. So as I mentioned, I've been fortunate to spend a lot of years in this space. And so happened to be a part of one of the first organizations in the nation born out of necessity, trying to create an ecosystem and one that's inclusive. And so we think about the technology incubators, we think about the business accelerators, we think about the research labs, we think about the offices of technology commercialization at universities, we think about corporate partners. And so you have a lot of typical players at this point in time, city to city to city, by different names, but generally speaking, they'll fall into one of those buckets: angel funds, angel networks, incubators, et cetera. And what I find, Carmen, is that so often, and it's one of these things that in so many ways is sort of the natural course of business, where people do business in networks that they naturally sort of know and trust, but that often flies in the face of an inclusive ecosystem, which by design means you have to reach out to disconnected audiences that are not generally a part of said ecosystems. And so often when you look at these organizations and how they do what they do, how they go about generating deal flow, how they go about generating capital, how they go about identifying talent, what networks are they working in, who are they in collaboration with that are part of communities that, be that African-American, Latino, et cetera, that are typically not at the table. And so I like to start with the identification of the main players, if you will, and then begin to examine who they're doing business with.
Awesome. Excellent, Darren. Thank you, Tomás. From your perspective, and again, as we think about sort of from the real estate angle, what are some of the key components of an economic ecosystem? And then we'll dive into making them more inclusive.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is to understand why your community is there. What's there? What is the reason why people chose to live in this particular part of your region? Mm-hmm. What is the competitive advantage of that particular space? And then building around that, because that's not going to be replicated. It's not going to be moved. It can't be relocated because someone offers that thing a better tax incentive someplace else. So you look for those fixed assets, those anchors that aren't going to go anywhere. And then the second thing you look at is like, okay, what's our leakage? What's happening that people are going away from us to access? Is it a type of store, type of service? Is it a particular resource that we could easily develop locally and support with a little bit of public policy or some funding to kind of incentivize those kinds of actions? And then the third thing is political will. Is there real political will to figure out how to become an incentive and low-hanging fruit for people making decisions? Because when we talk about real estate development, we're talking about significant investments that people are going to expect returns over time, and they want a long-term partner that is going to understand the risks that they're taking and is going to do what they can to minimize those risks as much as reasonably possible. And so that ecosystem, it needs to understand where are you, what's your competitive advantage, what are the things that aren't going to be moving, and what levers do you have access to that you can begin to pull in order to incentivize the other components of stuff that you don't control or that you need to have to come in to support what you're doing.
So what I'm hearing, Tomás, is from both you and Darren is that we've got to understand what are the sort of capacity building players in a space, as well as what are the differentiators of the space that we can capitalize on to attract capital, right? To attract investment and to attract talent, deals, and capital, right? Which we'll get into each of those components in a second. But okay, as we think about, so these things tend to be fixed, right? Who the players are, what the entities are, they tend to be fixed, and they tend to be moving, as Darren kind of mentioned, in the normal course of business, which oftentimes, people, it's a human nature. You do business with people you trust, people you like, that you're comfortable with, and oftentimes that means people like you, right? So what are the ways that we can begin to, as we think about those fixed pieces, what are the ways that we can start to move those ecosystems in a more inclusive direction? I'll flip it back to you, Darren.
Sure. Thank you, Carmen. Yeah, I have always welcomed that particular question because what it does is really gets to the heart of the day-to-day operations of some of the organizations that I mentioned. And so, so as I mentioned, most of these, when we talk about these entrepreneurial ecosystems, be that for the startup ecosystem, be that for scale ups, whatever sort of, play we're focusing on, generally speaking, it still comes back to this deal flow, capital, and talent. So when I'm working with organizations, it's like, well, let me understand when you're sourcing deals, through what networks are you sourcing deals? Are any of these networks either led by people of color, affiliated with people of color? So let me understand the networks. Real quick example, I was some years back working with an organization that was doing a lot of entrepreneurial events. And so, but very few people of color would show up at the events. And so let's talk about, again, how are you communicating? Who are you working with? Are you doing it in partnership with any minority serving organizations or in affiliation with? And so we help them really just identify some partners. I like to call them relevant, but disconnected, right? And so I always try to identify what's the relevant audience to you, but that you're disconnected from. Another quick example, working with healthcare organizations often that are trying to identify healthcare innovations and such, but we often don't see a lot of people of color participating in that activity. Same deal. So, okay, are you working, for example, in collaboration with an organization like the National Medical Association? Is there any awareness? This is, 50,000 plus physicians of color, right? And so relevant, but disconnected, right? And so through all of these mechanisms, it's not that difficult so often to really identify this point of relevancy. There's a lot of people of color that could be participating, for example, as angel investors. They have the same profile of an accredited investor, but they're not at the table, right? And so how do we reach out to these different audiences? And so to your point, it is often additional work beyond your normal networks. And so that's where these ecosystems either thrive or struggle, because someone has to make that intervention, that additional intentional work to engage disconnected audiences.
Yeah. So, right. So you have the option, right, of you can either build a new ecosystem focused on it, on being inclusive, which is a huge lift, or we can focus on making current ecosystems more inclusive, which is a heavy lift, but probably a bit easier and more effective, quite frankly, right? More certainly more efficient. Tomás, what are your thoughts on driving ecosystems in more inclusive directions?
So I think Dúran brings up a lot of really good points, and I would be echoing a lot of what he's saying. I really like your point about relevant but not included, or part of my paraphrasing. And I think it comes back to also what I was mentioning earlier, is like understanding who you are and who's in your community, why they're there, why are people choosing to live and do business in your space. Sometimes it's because it's really inexpensive. That's fine. Where I live in Uptown Whittier, before we did our specific plan in our historic business district, the space was like 25 cents a square foot because nobody wanted to be there because there was no parking. And we created a specific plan, and that low barrier to entry allowed a lot of entrepreneurs to come in. And now it's a destination for restaurants or for date nights, because there's 40 restaurants that are really, really good, all located in a really tight little cozy kind of space. So understanding that why people are in that space allowed us to create a path that let other entrepreneurs and investors follow in that space. The people who can control the capital know how to make money, and but there's also limited amount of time and energy for them. And so they're going to go to paths where they feel like there's reduced risk, or where they feel like there's good return, or where there's other people. But the more you can do to make them aware of the opportunity in your space, by knowing what your competitive advantage is, by understanding and being able to tell your story, the more successful you're going to be to get them to change what they're doing just a little bit. Because you don't need the market to change and make a radical left. You just need a slight tweak. And then the funny thing happens, it's like when water starts breaking through a barrier, it just takes a little bit at first, and then it just starts flowing a lot more. So as the inclusivity part of that is understanding who lives there now, and how do you prepare those people to take advantage of this growth in the local economy? How can we prepare them either for coming jobs, or for new opportunities with regard to construction, or with new opportunities with regard to business locations and that sort of thing, so that when an investor comes and wants to talk to you about your economy or your community, you can talk about what you're doing to promote that local entrepreneurship, that local energy, that vibe that they're going to want to become part of. Now, the reality is, the way financing is set up, a lot of debt is going to require national credit tenants to be part of the mix for a large real estate development. And that's going to be a challenge for a lot of smaller cities that aren't on the radar for the national credit tenants. National credit tenant is going to be the large restaurants like Applebee's. It's going to be the big well-known grocery stores, the big box retails, the stuff that people kind of know, like name brand kind of stuff, right? As opposed to your local stores and that kind of things. And so it's not just that, you're working to raise awareness about stuff. You also have to understand how the capital markets are working, what can get financed, and what happens when when you tell the developer, we want a locally owned grocery store in this spot, and the developer comes back and says, that's fine, but I can only finance 40% of that.
Yeah.
What's going to be the difference? The reason I'm raising that now is because if you understand your local economy, if you understand the strength of your local business, if you understand what's happening in that space, it's much easier to convince the decision makers, hey, we need to support this in order for to get that local business here. And this is why it's important for our local business to be in this space. This is how we're going to push back against gentrification. This is how we're going to make sure that we're generating that the profits that are being generated are going to stay here with, and be recycled in our communities. So inclusivity, excuse me, it's a long game. It's also understanding the space that you're working in and how those decisions are being made by the people who control the capital.
Yeah, understood, Tomás. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, Tomás is also a bit under the weather, so we want to give him a special thank you for rallying and being with us today. But you know what, Tomás, you have brought up a few really interesting points that I'd love to kind of double click on. And as we move into the capital and financing part of this conversation. When I think about the key components of an ecosystem, we can talk about the individual players, but I kind of break them into these sort of three buckets, right? You got your public sector sources, right? So legislatively available capital. You have your private sector, right? So whether that is, you know, sort of banks or private investments, real estate, private equity, you know, other sources along those lines, maybe even the CDFIs and those kinds of sources. Then you also have philanthropy, right? So you've got these three big buckets of capital types. How I'm gonna pop back to Dúran to give you a break, Tomás. But Dúran, talk about how you go about engaging and integrating those three types of capital into what ultimately seeks to be an inclusive ecosystem.
Sure. Thanks, Carmen. That's such an important question and topic. So to your point, particularly from the public standpoint, and over the past, decade plus, we've seen a lot of, states really identifying significant resources to invest in a quote unquote ecosystem. Most of the standard organizations that I mentioned, the incubators, the angel funds and angel networks have been leveraging these dollars now for some time. But those same dollars, to your point, generally come with a matching requirement that they have to match those dollars through, whether it's a private or philanthropic resource. The matching varies. Sometimes it's 50 cents on the dollar. Sometimes it's dollar for dollar. But super critical. And those same resources come, of course, with anticipated outcomes and metrics that are required, or at least those that are applying for those dollars have to sort of articulate what the plan and strategy will be to realize the sort of outcomes that the community is trying to achieve. Of late, I would say the past couple of years, while there's still so much more room for growth here, I've also have seen an increase in these same funding sources requiring more of the grantees, the individuals going after these dollars, to also demonstrate what's their inclusion strategy. Because historically, it would fundamentally be these mainstream organizations going after state dollars, corporate, partners participating, local philanthropy participating. But those money resources have been improving in terms of holding the line on, as part of these outcomes that we're shooting for, demonstrate to me how you're going to achieve more inclusive outcomes. So making it part of a requirement of the application process. But certainly the philanthropic side, whether that's local philanthropy or certainly national philanthropy, has been leveraged in many ways as well as part of this same sort of matching requirement. Most of these funders don't like to be the only funders in, right? So you've got to leverage these various resources. And so you nailed it. And those are the three buckets. Typically from community to community, there are a handful of your largest employers that are sought after to generally match some of the money coming out of the state, as well as what's coming out of local and regional philanthropy. So again, I'm encouraged by these dollars carrying now more of a requirement to demonstrate how the recipients of said funding are going to be intentionally inclusive about their work.
Excellent, thank you, Tomás. So your thoughts on the different kinds of capital sources from that public, philanthropy, and private sector, and how to integrate those into the inclusive ecosystem.
So this is a challenge with real estate, right? The real estate tends to be such an enormous cost to the project that it's going to drive a lot of different things afterwards. It's going to drive what rent rates you can set beyond just the market. It's going to drive who's going to be your tenants. It's going to drive what different who you're hiring to build it. And so when you bring in the public sources of money, whether they're from the groups like the Economic Development Administration, maybe from a state funded program, or a lot of the publics, at least take a step back, any of the federally sourced programs, they're going to trigger prevailing wage or Davis-Bacon laws, right? And that means that it makes the project more expensive for the developer. And so a lot of times when you have someone coming to you and saying, hey, we need support, you know, especially around the finance and the bottom line, there's an understanding that it might make your project X percentage more expensive because now your wages have to go up. And then there's also a community benefits agreement. And then there's also, right? So there's always going to be some give and take with the public sector of sources because they're public treasure. That's our tax dollars. They should be used in a way that's judicious and fair and that empowers the communities that they work in, right? So it shouldn't be just a giveaway. Well, at least that's the way it shouldn't work. I know it does sometimes it's that way. But when you look at that, just understand that you may have public dollars behind your project, but you got to understand that from the developer's perspective, that those things come with strings attached, right? And you understand what those strings are and understand why they're there, so that when you get the pushback, you can successfully tell them, well, this is why it's important to us. And this is why we feel like it's se vale la pena. It's worth the effort and the energy to make this work.
Right.
Now, when you look at the private sector, like the private sector's got enough money to do what it wants to do, right? I mean, there's more money than there is good ideas, right? So but the understanding that the private sector is also risk mitigation, and there's a reason why you have communities that look great on paper, but they're being completely missed by the private sector. South Los Angeles is home to more than 1 million people. It's surrounded by enormous economic engines that generate billions of dollars of activity every week, sometimes every day, but it's completely left out of it. Why? There's structural reasons there. Some of them are racist, some of them are not racist, some of them are just, there's a lot of reasons for that. So you need to understand what's happening around your spaces so that you can change those things to get the private sector to make a little tweak to get the outcome that you want. And then finally, philanthropic, you know, it's getting more and more competitive, challenging to get significant amount of philanthropic dollars in early. Everybody wants to be the last dollar in. They want to be the last money that they know is going to be, you know, once the project has the rest of the capital stack, once the project has its tenants, once the project has its permits, that's when everybody wants to jump in and be like, okay, yeah, we'll fund the project, right? And so that early money is going to be the highest risk and the hardest to get. And that's sometimes where the public sector can come in with some pre-development funding or understanding that if you're asking the private market to do that for you, if you're asking the developer to come in at the riskiest time with the riskiest, you know, money in terms of the lowest return not the lowest return, but the highest risk to their investment, that you understand that what's going on from their mindset. So I guess I should say each of these different sources have different expectations. They have different moments in time when they want to come in. And then, you know, I would say the private sector, if you look at the equity and the debt, it even adds more to the complexity. So it's really understanding that you understand each of these different perspectives so that when you're crafting and pushing forward an agenda, or you're promoting your community and you're saying, private sector, come here, right? That you're able to speak and convince them and talk to them in the language that makes sense to them.
Thank you, Tomás. I want to stay here just for a second, just because I know, Tomás, you quoted this notion of, or mentioned this notion of political will. And it makes me think, Darren, of that Ohio Third Frontier legislation that was, set to specifically to build more inclusive, more thriving, innovative corridors and ecosystems throughout the state. But that did bring together all three of these sources. So can you talk a bit about how that capital came together, how it played together, how you, in those roles back in those days, you went about raising the different kinds of capital? I think that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carmen. Yeah, I would say, that the Ohio Third Frontier was significantly catalytic, right? From the standpoint of really spurring on Ohio's innovation ecosystem with a very significant commitment in the billions over time. That again had to be leveraged with this, matching contribution from private sector and philanthropy. But what it also did, Carmen, was really set the stage and tone, and in this case, the innovation ecosystem, if you will, by very specifically defining the industries that the state would really develop its strengths in. So your venture-backed industries, this was very much about raising additional venture capital to really spur on, whether it be, robotics, medical innovations, power and propulsion, AI, software. I mean, just to go down the list of sort of venture-backed spaces. And so it galvanized not just the dollars, but all the players. And to my point about, how do you engage the angel investment community? All of these organizations participated because, frankly, the Ohio Third Frontier created the foundation for this engagement. And so then it was, frankly, a lot of blocking and tackling from the standpoint of identifying key CEOs and corporate leaders that were, really about, further developing the community where everyone works, lives, and plays. This was an opportunity for significant leverage by galvanizing the business community with the state's catalytic investment. And so very specific metrics around what are the number of business starts that we're shooting for over the next so many years. What are what critical measure of follow-on capital? So as we assist entrepreneurs in raising early stage funds, how are we also tracking the follow-on venture capital that really signifies growth that's actually taking place? So very precise and significant metrics. So it was not just the money, but the strategy and the plan that went with it, down to, again, the industries, the anticipated outcomes, et cetera. And as time has gone on, as I mentioned, far more intentionality about making sure that all that I described, the innovation networks, the venture-backed industries, how are we bringing more diverse participants to that work? And so, and because there's I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that when we talk about ecosystems, it's important for community to community to community to sort of map what their sort of current landscape looks like. And in most cases, the mainstream organizations that I mentioned, the incubators and angel funds and corporations, et cetera. But on the sort of disconnected side of the equation, you have, in most communities, a series of business support organizations that have been in play, but not connected to this work, right? And I think that without going into too much of the dark history of our nation, but the reality is the whole separate but equal doctrine spawned dual ecosystems, right? And so it's just the reality. So there's a lot of just divided networks that there's still a lot of bridge building that's required to really, again, to my point about this relevant but disconnected scenario. So particularly we talk about things like venture capital, where by design, if you go to any typical venture event, you will not see generally a lot of people of color, right? And so these are networks that still require a lot of intentional engagement, a lot of intentional preparation and readiness, but progress is certainly being made. And so that I think back to, I would venture to say, if you will, that throughout the state of Ohio in this example, it all kind of points back to the Ohio Third Frontier as this catalytic resource, again, both in dollars, strategy, matching requirements, industries, inclusiveness. It really was the galvanizer of the entire network.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are already coming up on our time, so I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk. Just two more things very quickly, and Tomás, I'll jump over to you. You've talked a lot about kind of, knowing what your differentiator is, right? What is the thing that is your value driver? One of the things that I'm interested in hearing from you is, as you think about real estate, as you think about economic development, right? And we think about that against the background of an inclusive ecosystem. How do we ensure that access to deals, especially big, gigantic deals like the ones you've been talking about, is equitably provided, right? How do we make sure, what are the levers that can be pulled? What are the requirements or metrics that can be put in place to ensure that access to those deals is equitably available?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was an easy answer. And the reality is that I think the industry and people a lot smarter than me have been working on this for quite some time, because of the ties to the public dollars that go to projects of this scale. And the reality is there's not enough professionals in the space. And so it's not, you have to make the effort, like when we say affirmative action, making the actual effort to go in and recruit from those communities, but also creating that pipeline of professionals. Now, there's I'm in California, and one of the things that California did way before I was born was make significant investments in our education system. So everybody knows about like our UC system and your Berkeley and UCLA and right? But what a lot of people sleep on is our Cal State system, which is the powerhouse of this state. And the dozens of Cal States that we have that are accessible to our communities all up and down the state. Silicon Valley is successful because of San Jose State. It's San Jose State because that's where the workers came from. That's where the engineers, that's where the workforce came from to implement a lot of the ideas and capital that was coming out of Berkeley and Stanford. And we see that infrastructure within those Cal States that has the ability to to train those professionals and create a pipeline or a flow of people who are ready for those opportunities. Yeah. But it doesn't happen just like that overnight. It's got to be a concerted plan that comes back to the community saying, ¿sabes qué? We need people who are ready for these kinds of jobs, who are ready for these kinds of opportunities. Every developer I know would love to hire a person of color. They would love to hire someone who is, from the communities where they want to do work, because it makes them more relevant. It makes it easier for them to go to a public hearing and talk about how well they know the community. I'm working on a project right now in Boyle Heights. Yeah. And I gotta tell you, if you can't speak to the community and create programs for the community, you're not gonna get any. So I would say that it starts with workforce development. It starts with, actively looking for those companies that are ready to go, and then supporting or bringing in organizations like Dúran's to help the ones that are there, but just need to grow to the point that they can be competitive in that space. Excellent. We have Karen Suarez saying that she's made in the CSU. So you struck a chord there with one of our attendees. Guys, we're going to go ahead and move into the Q&A. We've already got some really great questions here, but first I want to thank you again for sharing your insights, your perspectives,
on the issues that we've talked about. One final note that I do want to say that, Tomás, I think you were kind of going in this direction, and Dúran, you and I have had these conversations ad nauseum, but we didn't get to really dive into the talent piece and why it's so important to have diverse people on your teams. And the perspective that they bring, the insights that they might have about what really are the value drivers in these different kinds of communities, right? Who are the networks that you should be connecting to make sure that you're getting the deals and the opportunities out to a broad and inclusive, group of professionals, companies, and individuals is, that diverse talent can be critical to providing those perspectives and that access. So I'm going to go in and, Eddie, I can actually see all of the questions. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump in here. First, I want to thank Tomás for the very kind remarks he was thanking us. Tomás Morales was thanking us for being here today. So thank you, Tomás. We're delighted to have this opportunity. Robert Carrillo is asking a question about opportunity zones. They can bypass the public sector, which can help developers bypass that community benefit and really put gentrification on steroids. Are opportunity zones here to stay? Are they reliable moving forward? And what are the ways that we can ensure that that there's a community benefit when an opportunity zone is in place? And Tomás, I'm going to direct that at you.
Yeah, I think Robert hit on the head. It's a bypass.
Mm-hmm.
It was created and intended to allow people to it's basically a tax shelter. I have not seen it work on a large scale. I think the massive benefit of it has passed. It's set already in terms of those returns. It might be a tool that continues to get tweaked and used. The good thing is that once these tools are there, the people who manage them at the public policy level can continue to kind of tweak them and make them a little more accountable. My favorite tool is new market tax credits. It's great because it's very, you can use it in a variety of different ways. It's also challenging because you can use it in a variety of different ways. And so there's no one simple solution for it. And it requires, a pretty good understanding of how to make it work. But it can create that 20% piece that's missing for a large scale real estate project that's between, $10 to $20 million. And, it does have requirements go along with it, but there's a lot of pros and cons to it. So opportunity zones, I think they are here to stay. I agree with you. They are something that's used to bypass a lot of the community benefit agreement and impact mitigation programming. But I don't think they're a tool that's going to gain widespread use, especially as the stock market changes. I mean, they were created as a shelter for people who wanted to move money out of the stock market into real estate. And that's just, it hasn't really panned out to be, useful for that right now.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to go over to you, Dúran. I think this is right up your alley. Nonprofits and CDFIs de-risk investment. How can we get the private sector to see how businesses being supported by community-based organizations are worth investing in?
Yeah, great question. So, to your point, certainly a big part of my day-to-day routine. So in part, when I think about how we further sort of connect to the power structure, the resources in the community, et cetera, certainly this ongoing journey of communicating the win-win. What's the big benefit for the region as a whole? To your point, Carmen, about engaging, whether it be that talent. There's no community that can't stand to improve its base of talent, that can't stand to improve its base of entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs that have growth opportunity, improve the capital flow, and helping communities understand what they're leaving on the sidelines by not engaging the CDFIs and other organizations. And so tying it into the sort of broader regional strategy, and particularly the upside lift that the community stands to benefit from. So when I'm going after these resources, I'm always looking forward with respect to the economic lift that further engaging these disconnected audiences, as you mentioned, what that brings. We are, make no mistake, city to city, region to region. It is a battle for talent. And so those regions that are very intentional about demonstrating that they have opportunities for a ever increasing diverse population will absolutely attract a disproportionate number of this population as it becomes more diverse. And so versus a community that doesn't engage some of these disconnected communities and networks and audiences, you will, if you're not already, you'll begin to decline. And so it's the business case, Carmen. It's the regional business case and this missing element and how it can be leveraged to really take the region as a whole to another level. I like to real quickly communicate often that this is not a zero-sum game. So this is a scenario by investing in the CDFIs and such that we're talking about, everyone wins, and the importance of communicating and defining what that win looks like. Additional businesses, additional job creation, capital creation, really getting very specific about what that economic lift entails and not leaving it just a general narrative.
Excellent. Increase on the tax base, all that good stuff, right?
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's keep it moving. We have a question. I'm gonna go over here very quickly. So are there any figures with respect to investment in minorities and Latinos in the IT and cyber verticals around investments from banks, PE, angel investments versus traditional investments? That's from Alfred Ortiz. So there is not information on the percentages of capital that's going into Latinos and any other ethnically diverse groups for that matter. What we are seeing in the what I'll call the private investment, alternative investment space is an increase in funds owned by Latinos and other people of color who are focused specifically on investing in what they call underrepresented founders, right? So the good news is that because there's more of us owning and controlling those sources of capital, we have a greater propensity for investing in them. I don't know where to find, unfortunately, the specifics on IT and cyber. One group you may want to look at is the Hispanic IT Executive Council. They may have some resources around that since that's their focus. Let's see, Tomás, we have been working with the city of San Bernardino to rejuvenate the downtown of the city, and we want to create the University Center as an anchor to attract businesses. Any ideas?
Oh, yes. I love San Bernardino, and I was there for a White House event not too long ago, and it struck me how gorgeous that campus is and the setting around it with the mountains right behind it was ridiculously gorgeous. And I think part of the challenge that San Bernardino has is that it's fighting for attention amongst the other small cities in the surrounding community. You got, Riverside right next door with the Cheech and with all the stuff that it's doing there, the guys on the limelight. And so part of it is raising the recognition about the viability of that local economy and the commitment of this local anchor institution to the community. And not just that you want to see new businesses there, but that the buying power of the university is focused on supporting that local economy, that it's encouraging its staff to live closer because to reduce emissions and commuting time, but also to make sure that the dollars that are coming and cycling through that university are being recycled locally through that area, and demonstrating to the city that its most important partner is serious about making those kinds of investments. We have one of the great things about Southern California is we have a lot of small cities. They each have their own little culture and custom and focus. One of the bad things is that we have a lot of these small cities that become principalities and you start competing with each other. And for the longest time, we had greenfields around San Bernardino, and that time is gone. And so now it's the opportunity to kind of rebrand who the city is and the opportunities and the wonderful quality of life you can have living there and accessing not only the university, but the county seat, the city government, and all the other great things around it.
Excellent. Eddie, I just want to do a quick check and, okay, so we have some more time that we can continue answering questions. Dúran, I'm going to go over to you. What can we do to train, inform, and this is Marco Lopez asking the question, train, inform, and develop the VC community, and especially the people of color within those VCs, to understand that our deals, right, the deals owned by diverse founders might be a bit different, right? They're not going to come in that very packaged, necessarily polished, framework that they're used to seeing, but how they can still identify the value there. What can we do to sort of train investors to understand how to invest in our communities and see the value?
That is such a great question, and that is a topic for an entire webinar. But I'll try to be brief. It's interesting that there's so many dynamics to that question. When I think about even watching a lot of the traditional venture processes where a founder is looking to raise capital, and one of the first questions is, well, have they raised venture capital before? And so when they're trying to identify a CEO, for example, which that very question often flies in the face of engaging more people of color who have been disconnected from the venture capital community. And so it's one, helping people understand transferable skills. You don't have to be someone that has been a serial entrepreneur from the standpoint of raising venture capital to grow a scalable business. And so how do transferable skills, a lot of folks, whether they're coming out of corporate America and they've been responsible for launching product lines and having P&L responsibilities, how does that transfer to kind of growing their own operation? And so it's helping folks broaden the narrative. It's helping folks understand that, because as we know, the venture community is often a herd community, all kind of herding towards, a handful of key markets. But there's various other markets out there that, as we do it, and continue to do a good job of defining those markets, demonstrating that there's other sort of $1 billion or better markets out there, and how the opportunity that's being presented creates this unique niche in that space. So it's very much an education. It is not easy work. We're talking about just this herd mentality and a traditional way of doing things. And so it's definitely not easy work. But I think that focusing on, what I like to tell entrepreneurs is focusing on the upside. Generally speaking, the upside and the differentiation. Because generally speaking, we've been successful in helping what some might consider ideas that wouldn't necessarily land on typical venture capital tables, getting them funding because there was a clear and significant upside, i.e., a very significant potential couple $100 million or better play, unique differentiation, because ultimately those two things really kind of drive investors. And so it is a lot to that, but I think focusing on the scale is super important. If you're going to attract equity capital, you've got to demonstrate the scale and the differentiation, and people will pay attention.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So we have, this is going to be our last question that we're going to answer, and I'll open it to either of you. How can we create scholarships or training programs locally to strengthen our competitiveness?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there just real quickly. Also, just a great question. And there's a lot of resources out there. We see a lot of corporations, philanthropy, making big commitments and big announcements around wanting to try to solve for widening racial wealth gaps and the like. And I think that this particular point often gets missed, this education, this piece that I also like to call readiness. When we think about even so many of our minority-led business support organizations, separate from those, Carmen, in your world of PE and the like, but your kind of traditional minority serving organizations often also could benefit from a trainer, if you will, because we have large numbers of our community that have not been versed in equity capital and the scale that goes along with that. So demonstrating how education can feed the very things that we're talking about, I think is absolutely huge. And I like the idea of sort of this train the trainer approach. We have a lot of organizations across the country serving minority populations, and those same leaders, quite frankly, are often disconnected from the venture and the activities that we're talking about. And so I think that's game changing, in my opinion. And approaching the philanthropic resources and others with that business case, I think, is game changing.
Awesome, Darren, thank you. Tomás, did you have something?
Real quick, and it was more related to business. And I think, look, if you do a 30-day search back in your local newspaper, you'll find at least 2 or 3 stories about businesses that closed because of a retiring owner. One of the ways you can make your community more competitive is understanding who owns your businesses and what stage are they in that business. Are they ready to retire? Are they looking to retire? And then the training that you can do with the key managers to help them buy those businesses so that they don't get sold and rolled up and taken away somewhere else, or they don't get closed. Mm-hmm. And one of the missing components right now across the country is opportunities for workplace entrepreneurs to take a step to go from being the person who's operating the business in absentia because the owner's never there to the person that owns it. Yep. And it's a one way to sidestep a lot of the institutional barriers that keep women and people of color from becoming entrepreneurs, because they're already there, and we're there in the same percentage as the rest of the population. It's just there's so many different things that keep us from following that path earlier in life. So if your community can work with your local CDFIs or your workforce boards to start identifying who those key managers are that are willing to buy the business where they work and continue to operate it, that's one of the great ways to make sure that your economy stays local and you're keeping those jobs. It's not sexy, it's not shiny, but it's effective.
Yeah. Excellent, guys. Okay, we are already a minute past the end, so I know Eddie's probably sitting at the edge of her seat. But I want to share one final point. Many of you are in positions inside of public sector entities, and you have tremendous power over those companies that want to do business with you. So you're able to put in requirements to engage a certain percentage of diverse entrepreneurs in a real estate project, for example. And you can make databases of the relevant types of businesses available to them so they have no excuse. There are many states around the country that have these kinds of resources available. The other thing that I would share is you're looking for data and the tremendous opportunity within the Latino community. Aspen Institute always partners with McKinsey on their awesome report on the state of Latinos. And so I would definitely point you in the direction of that report to get a sense of the missed opportunity, right? The opportunity cost of not investing more with Latino businesses and Latinos writ large. So with that, we will bring this conversation to an end. Darren and Tomás, thank you so much. You were fantastic. And thank you to the audience for giving us your time and attention today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We will share the recording to this webinar, and please stay tuned for our next session. And thank you to our speakers.